California is facing a fiscal crisis that threatens to undermine its ability to provide essential services and invest in its future. The state's budget deficit has grown from $22.5 billion in 2023 to an estimated $25 billion in 2024, according to the Legislative Analyst's Office. This means that the state does not have enough revenue to cover its spending commitments, and will have to make difficult choices to balance its budget. How did this happen? There are several factors that contributed to the state's deteriorating fiscal situation, including the COVID-19 pandemic, which caused a sharp decline in economic activity and tax revenues, especially from personal income taxes that depend on high-income earners. The state also had to spend more on public health, unemployment benefits, and other emergency measures to respond to the crisis. High inflation, which eroded the purchasing power of the state's revenues and increased the cost of providing services and benefits. The state's inflation rate was 6.2% in October 2024, the highest since 1990. The threat of a recession, which could further reduce the state's revenues and increase its expenditures. The state's economy has been recovering from the pandemic, but it still faces significant risks and uncertainties, such as the spread of new variants of the virus, supply chain disruptions, labor shortages, and rising interest rates. The mismatch between the state's revenue structure and its spending obligations. The state relies heavily on volatile sources of revenue, such as personal income taxes on high-income earners and capital gains taxes on stock market gains. These revenues tend to fluctuate with the business cycle, creating boom and bust cycles for the state budget. On the other hand, the state has committed to spending on programs and services that grow faster than revenues over time, such as education, healthcare, pensions, and debt service. The state's budget deficit is not only a short-term problem, but also a long-term challenge. The Legislative Analyst's Office projects that the state will face an operating deficit of $17 billion by 2025, meaning that its ongoing revenues will fall short of its ongoing expenditures. This gap will continue to grow unless the state takes action to align its revenues and expenditures. The state's budget deficit has serious consequences for its residents and its future. It limits the state's ability to fund its priorities and meet its obligations. It forces the state to make trade-offs between competing needs and interests. It reduces the state's fiscal flexibility and resilience to cope with unexpected shocks and emergencies. It undermines the state's credit rating and increases its borrowing costs. And it erodes public trust and confidence in the state government. The state's budget deficit is a complex and multifaceted problem that requires a comprehensive and balanced solution. The state cannot rely on one-time fixes or temporary measures to close its budget gap. It needs to adopt a long-term fiscal plan that addresses both the revenue side and the spending side of the budget equation. It needs to reform its tax system to make it more stable, fair, and efficient. It needs to prioritize its spending and invest in its core functions and goals. And it needs to engage with stakeholders and the public to build consensus and support for its fiscal choices. In this section, we will look at how Governor Newsom's plan to balance the budget relies on money raised from bonds, tapping into reserves, renewing a tax on managed care programs, and delaying or cutting funding for various programs, especially in climate and transportation. As you may know, California is facing a huge budget deficit of $31.5 billion due to the economic impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. This means that the state has to find ways to reduce its spending and increase its revenue to avoid running out of money. One of the ways that Newsom proposes to do this is by raising money from bonds. Bonds are essentially loans that the state issues to investors who agree to lend money to the state for a certain period of time and receive interest payments in return. Newsom's budget plan relies on $12 billion from bonds that voters approved in previous elections for various purposes, such as housing, water, education, and health care. By using these bonds, Newsom hopes to avoid cutting funding for these critical areas. Another way that Newsom plans to balance the budget is by tapping into reserves. Reserves are savings that the state sets aside for emergencies or rainy days. Newsom's budget plan uses $450 million from the state's Safety Net Reserve, which is a fund that supports programs for low-income Californians, such as Medi-Cal, CalWORKs, and CalFresh. Newsom argues that using this reserve is necessary to protect the most vulnerable Californians from the effects of the pandemic. A third way that Newsom aims to balance the budget is by renewing a tax on managed care programs. Managed care programs are health plans that contract with the state to provide health care services to Medi-Cal beneficiaries. Newsom's budget plan proposes to extend a tax on these plans that was set to expire in 2021 to 22. This tax generates about $1.7 billion per year for the state and helps fund Medi-Cal, which covers nearly 14 million Californians. A fourth way that Newsom tries to balance the budget is by delaying or cutting funding for various programs, especially in climate and transportation. Newsom's budget plan reduces funding for climate initiatives by $1 billion, such as cap-and-trade programs, forest management, and clean energy projects. Newsom's budget plan also delays funding for transportation projects by $2 billion, such as road maintenance, high-speed rail, and transit improvements. Newsom says that these reductions are temporary and will be restored when the economy recovers. These are some of the main ways that Governor Newsom's plan to balance the budget relies on money raised from bonds, tapping into reserves, renewing a tax on managed care programs, and delaying or cutting funding for various programs, especially in climate and transportation. In the next section, we will discuss how California's budget bomb will affect you and what you can do about it.